Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is SmartHER News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our SmartHER series features unique people who help us think and live smarter.
Well, we have a surreal moment, really, because we are sitting down with the one and only Hollie McKay, who we have been corresponding with in Afghanistan for the last several months. And so for 5 months, Hollie's been one of the few independent journalists on the ground in Afghanistan. And we've been lucky enough, Hollie, for you to talk to us at SmartHER News and some of the most critical times, arguably, of the war in Afghanistan, and now moving forward, looking to what's next in Afghanistan. So it's so good to be able to reach out and touch you in person and to see you.
Thank you for your
in
support.
person. So it was back in mid-August. We spoke right before.
I think it was the night before Mazar fell, wasn't it? Because I was going out with the commandos. So I think it was the night I was in Mazar, and it was the night before it fell. And I was going out with the commandos, the Afghan commandos. And I remember we talked, and then I went out with them all night, and they convinced me that it was never going to fall. And I believed them, and how wrong I was. Like, if you'd told me it was going to be within 24 hours, I just wouldn't have believed you.
But that was such a critical part of understanding what was going on with the war. So to set the scene, for many Americans, what was going on in the war in Afghanistan was sort of a faraway story. And then all of a sudden, all of this information and energy started swirling around in August. And this question about when was the United States really going to leave? And could the Taliban actually take control? And that seemed to be something that few people could consider. And that's why it was valuable to talk to you, because you were on the ground. How did you decide to go there?
So originally I decided to go, so my photographer Jake and I talked about it earlier, probably in the spring, I would say. And we thought we would go and just sort of document the American withdrawal. I thought it was a critical time to do that. And really, I thought I would be documenting the first few months of the Afghan government trying to stand on its own 2 feet. That was the intention. And I had no idea that the Talibans were going to take over before America had even left.
And so how many times had you been in Afghanistan before that?
Twice before.
And in what time periods was that?
2017, 2018.
And so that was still also a very important time in the war.
Yes.
And what was happening then? Because I'd like to understand when you were there now this year, what a contrast that was.
So it was actually a lot more volatile when I was there, I think, in a different way. So you really couldn't travel much outside of Kabul. There were suicide bombings almost every single day. It felt a lot more on edge. There was attacks still from the ISIS-K. You had the Taliban. You had different groups. And so it felt very fragile, I think, even with Americans being there. And it was really getting bigger at that point, and we didn't know where it was going to go.
So the story takes another unexpected twist. So when you come at 2021, you're under new American leadership, and a question about how does one actually end a war? What does that actually look like? So it's hard to summarize 5 months, but what is it like in Afghanistan? What was that like for you?
So I think initially it was just, there was so much that was unknown. Nobody knew. So when I ended up getting stuck there, it was nobody knew how the Talibans were going to treat a woman, a foreigner, a journalist. And so there was just a lot of uncertainty, I think. But as time went on, and I went back to Kabul as the Taliban had taken over. It was just bizarre. I think in the beginning, the first month, I would say September, it was this sort of crazy access we had to things. We got a letter from, I had the letter in my bag.
Well, let's go grab it. Do you still have it?
Yeah. Do you want to grab my bag? So you go to the foreign ministry, to Zabiullah Mujahid, who's the spokesperson for the Talibans, and he issues you, if you're a journalist, he issues you this letter that basically gives you permission to go around, and you just flash this letter. It's in Pashto. Basically says, whoever wrote you a letter, like whatever signing place wrote you a letter, and they to say you were a journalist?
I can make out the New York Post, which is one of the outlets that you reported for. Well, you reported for many of them, but one of them. So the New York Post I can read. Afghanistan Islamic Emirate Ministry of Information and Culture.
Yeah.
And so this was
your
always
passport. Yeah, it's basically what you flash to the Talibans at a checkpoint that give you permission to go in to wherever. So the first month was really easy. it was shockingly easy. You know, as a woman, I didn't even get security checked. I didn't get, like, I just walk into it. We literally walked up to a suicide bombing school and knocked on the door. That's how it
And
was.
did they let you in?
Yeah, they're like, okay, come in. And so we went in to do a story.
Now, why would they do that? Sounds so bizarre that they would want to talk to anyone, let alone a clearly Western journalist.
So the thing with the Taliban is they're very super stringent at following orders. So whatever they're told from the top, they follow it. And I think that at that point they were told, you know, welcome the media, let's get some stories out. The Talibans were trying to reform their image. And I think that's what they'd been given. So suddenly, and it was also, you have these people that have been living in the mountains for 20 years, fighting a war, and suddenly they're like able to walk freely around a street in the city.
Now they're in charge.
Now they're in charge, and they don't have to worry about being arrested or anything happening to them anymore. So for them, they're extreme hams. Like, you take a picture, and I swear, you know, for Jake, he just would get harassed all day on WhatsApp by the Talibans. Where's my picture? Where's my picture? They're obsessed with, they're obsessed with them. You know, they'll send even me, and usually they don't really correspond with a woman, but even me, you know, some of the Talibans ended up getting my number from someone and would harass me with pictures. And
because they wanted to, they wanted to tell their story.
Suddenly they felt like they were free. So that first month was it was so bizarre because it went from any time we tried to do a story previously in Afghanistan, you have to go through layers and layers and permission and layers. And now it's like you were just walking in to a conference with Mujahid or a conference with, you know, Siraj or whoever it was.
And you're mentioning some of the people that are some of the most wanted terrorists by the United States that are now in charge of the country.
Yeah.
And so this might be really hard to square for some people that's the sort of experience you had amongst people that we've been at war with for 2 decades.
And yeah, it is. And, you know, for me, and this was something, I actually read an op-ed about it, and last month, and it's something I've had to sit with a lot, was sort of so much of my job, and not just in Afghanistan, but other places, has been really sitting with terrorists, with, you know, the Taliban on this time. And, you know, they're talking about these stories of killing Americans, and kind of that's a prideful moment for them. And you have to reconcile with that a little bit. And, you know, I really think so much of what we do as journalism, it's not about giving them a voice or a platform. It's really trying to be that vehicle that presents communication from the other side. There's so much just sort of temptation to paint things as black and white, as good and bad. And it's just so much more nuance to it than that. And so I think an important part of journalism, and, you know, and because I don't work for the government, and I'm, you know, I have that freedom to talk to anybody that I want to. And I think that's an important part of doing war journalism, is to really sit with the other side, and to not interrogate them, to not sort of stick it to them. That's not my job, but just to understand why they do what they do. And I think that's something I really tried to do, you know, on a daily basis in corresponding with the Talibans. But, you know, it does definitely take some reflection at times, I think, you know, to not be upset, to not get angry, to not, to not sort of tell them the other side. You just got to really listen. It's about listening.
Is the Taliban still at war with America?
No, I don't get that impression. And honestly, when I talk to the Talibans and I ask them their thoughts on America, they say they want good relations with America. They want good relations with all countries. And I think that's really the key thing, is in the 90s when the Talibans were in power, and it's a very different Taliban now than it was then. I know that there is a temptation in the media to conflate, oh, they haven't changed, they're the same. That's not true. They've changed a lot. Social media, you know, they know that they're held accountable to a different level now. And I think in the 90s, there was no more isolated government than the Talibans. They were extremely isolated. Nobody gave them money. They never got UN recognition. And that was something they craved, that they never got. And so this time around, that's still the objective. They want to be recognized on a world stage. And I think just sort of it would be tone deaf for the international community to isolate them again, because what we saw in the 90s was they had no money. They had no money coming in, heavily sanctioned. The only person who came in and gave them not very much money, maybe $1.5 million, was Osama bin Laden. So they housed Osama bin Laden. He was a guest in their country because he was the only person that was giving them any money. And so I think it would be extremely tone deaf if we just took that same approach again and was like, well, we're not talking to these people.
So let's unpack that a little bit more, because in my reporting from back here, you'll talk to analysts who believe that there's no difference between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. They're actually the same. They share the same ideology. They're the same. They are the enemy. But what you're painting a picture of is something slightly different from what I'm hearing, but maybe it's not. So talk to us a little bit about that. Is there talk of Al-Qaeda in the streets of Afghanistan?
So the Talibans and Al-Qaeda do have a very different ideology. So Al-Qaeda has a much more global ideology. So they're wanting to enforce their versions of Sharia law, not just within Afghanistan, but in whatever country that they can reach, and punish the infidels and all of that. Where the Talibans have been very, since day one, since Mullah Omar founded the Talibans back in 1994, it's been a domestic ideology. Their goal is within Afghanistan's borders only. So they want to have a country that is Islamic in their view of how they see Islamic law, and they want to control that country, but they don't have any overreaching ideology. They're not ISIS, they're not Al-Qaeda, they're not trying to extend beyond their borders. So that is, I guess, what makes the two very different, and what very different national security threats. The Talibans were never given the designation of a terrorist organization by the US because they didn't have ambitions to, attack the US homeland, whereas Al-Qaeda obviously does.
And there are those, I think that's a mistake.
Yeah.
There's still an ongoing debate about that,
yeah.
right? So is there, from spending time in Afghanistan, did you hear anything about Al-Qaeda?
Yeah, and I
Al-Qaeda's...
questioned it a lot. So I did interview a guy who is an old school Al-Qaeda person who is now running intelligence for one of the big cities. And he's basically folded into the Talibans. But my understanding from him is that he doesn't have, he has the Taliban sort of whatever protocol the Talibans tell him to have. And he obviously works for Siraj Haqqani, who is the Minister of the Interior, who's wanted by the US government. So he...
As a terrorist.
Yeah, as a terrorist. So his mentality is really just, running intel and doing what he needs to do. And I did ask him about Al-Qaeda, and he basically said, Al-Qaeda exists, but they've been told they are not allowed to take any military action. They live mostly around the Pakistan border areas. And he said, we're very aware who Al-Qaeda is, and they're very closely monitored, and they're told, you are allowed to basically do nothing. And the second you try to do anything, you will be, arrested or avenged upon.
I noticed you're saying Talibans.
Yeah. That's how a lot of the Afghans speak about it. It's funny because we say the Taliban, but a lot of the Afghans, when you talk to them, they usually say the Talibans. And it kind of makes sense because Taliban means student in Pashto. So you're sort of saying, if we say the student, it doesn't make sense. But whereas when they say the students, it makes more sense. Clearly, it's addictive.
I'm so curious in all the stories that you've been able to report on. But I also just want to take a moment, because you're so casually speaking about sitting down across from the Taliban or across from Al-Qaeda, and there are very few people that I've ever talked to that have had that opportunity. Do you believe what they're saying? I mean, when you sit down and talk to them, do you believe what they're saying? What does it feel like to sit across from these people?
I think you have to take a lot with a grain of salt. Certainly, the Talibans have done a lot to prove themselves distrustworthy in many ways, but they are a government now. They're not an insurgency, so they're definitely trying to put forward a different face, and they want the world to see them very differently. And I tell them that to them, you have to give it time. You have to show, not by what you say, but your actions. You've been at war with America and its allies for 20 years. You can't expect them to suddenly recognize you and think that you're fine overnight. So I think, that's something that they have to accept, just as we have to kind of accept they're in power and they're not going anywhere anymore. But it is, at first, again, I didn't know what to expect, but my first experience with the Talibans, as I was leaving Mazar and they were driving me out of this hotel, it was like, welcome to Balkh province. The governor he was here to talk to you. And I was just like, what is going on?
So let's explain that a little bit. I
Yeah.
think that's important because when we first started talking, you were in a very important northern city
Yeah.
in Afghanistan. And there were moments, Holly, that we didn't know if you were safe. We didn't know if they'd come knocking on the door and drag you out. We didn't know. And we had to be very clear about that. It didn't happen.
Yeah.
But there were
they
some
were
sleepless nights. I was worried about you.
Thank you. They were downstairs trying to get in. And that was what was terrifying. We did not know what to expect. We had this idea of the Talibans that were at war with America for 20 years. And previous to that, when they were a government, they were an incredibly brutal government. Yeah, I think, honestly, Jenna, it was the first time in my life, and I've been in many different countries, many different war zones, suicide bombings, you name it, on every front line. And I just remember that night. It was a Saturday night. And being in this hotel and, they're all of a sudden surrounding you. I'm looking out the window and there's just all these Talibans on motorcycles shooting in the air. And I just remember thinking, oh my goodness, like that was the first time I think I really felt immense fear. Not immense fear, but fear. Like I'm someone who's hate using the word fearless, but generally I'm fairly fearless about most things. I go into it with understanding what I'm going into. Whereas this was just like, this wasn't in my plan. And that sense of unknown, I think, especially that first night, it was really daunting. Yeah.
And then ironically, the Taliban were key to you getting out.
Yeah, because what happened was the next day was when Kabul fell. So at that point, so that night, I had some contacts in DC that had called some very good people, top sort of FBI people and people in Kabul, in the Pentagon that were, talking about, well, we'll try to come and get you in the morning. We'll send, And so we're sort of planning all of this, thinking, okay, well, maybe this is just going to be a night and then we're going to get out the next day. And sort of the next morning comes and didn't hear anything. And then next thing you know, these news reports are coming up. Well, the Talibans are at the gate in Kabul. And then by early that afternoon, Kabul had fallen. And that's when I just knew, okay, there's no way I'm getting out of here. And if I'd had someone that had a good fixer that was still there, I might have been able to get out earlier. But at that point, I just thought, there's going to be so many other things going on. It's going to be incredibly difficult for anybody to get to us in Mazar.
And eventually you got frustrated enough that you went and talked to the Taliban.
Yeah. So I went and talked to the Talibans. I did, that was really the only option. Was we had to make contact with the Talibans, and it was actually through the help, and I said this to my contact in the US, and it was through somebody, an important person with the US Embassy in a neighboring country who would also help facilitate the contact through a middle person. And I went to meet with him later afterwards. I didn't really have the full story at that point. So anyway, we got out. They were incredibly hospitable to us. They're like, okay, come back.
Did they know you were American? Because you have an American passport, you have an Australian passport, correct?
They only knew we were Australian, I think. I didn't get the impression they knew we were Americans. But I don't know that it would have made any difference because they were just like, welcome to our country. And it was just very bizarre. And at the same time, I'm asking them questions and they're like, well, if you steal anything, you get your hand cut off and you get stoned and all these sort of things. And so it was this sort of very paradoxical conversation. But anyway, as it turned out, I went and had dinner one night with this representative from the State Department. And he said to me, he said, I've been doing, diplomacy for 40 years. And he said, I worked in every country and every impossible place. And he said, I never felt more frightened until when I greenlit you to get in the car with the Talibans. He's like the amount of relief we had when we found out that you were on the bridge and that they'd gotten you out. He's like, and I was really grateful for that because I just thought, he took such a huge risk with his career in going, okay, well, we're just going to have to do it this way.
And so you left the country and then came back in. That's an important part. So you actually left when everyone was trying to leave, and then you chose
to come back. I went to Uzbekistan and did a little bit of work there, and I would have come back immediately, but I stayed a little longer because out of respect to him, really. Out of respect to that diplomat who had put his career on the line to do what I was telling him to do.
Well, why go back?
Because I felt I felt very strongly that my work there wasn't done, that I'd planned to come to document whatever this phase was. And just because the US leaves a place doesn't mean the journalism needs to leave a place. And I had enough contacts that were still working in Afghanistan. There was a few British reporters I knew and some other people who were like, we're staying. And I thought, I can do this. I mean, if they're there, I think I'll be okay. So we really just waited sort of a few days, and it was a bit of a tenuous decision, mostly because I knew that my family would be very upset about me going back, and people that cared about me who were so happy when I got out were going to be upset that I was just going straight back. But I felt very strongly that there was an important story to tell, and that I needed to find whatever way I could get back.
I'm Hollie McKay, and Jake and I are currently driving from the Uzbek border all the way down to Kabul, and we're probably about 3.5 hours into it. It's probably going to take about maybe 9 or 10 hours. We've gone through lots of Taliban checkpoints, and so far no issues. They stamped us in with their Islamic Emirate stamp and recognized our previous visas. And just stay tuned. We're very committed to this story, and follow us for regular updates about life in Afghanistan after the United States. Thank you.
So let's pick up on the story. So now you mentioned the Taliban are in control. There's a real concern about a humanitarian crisis that's happening inside the country. We know that can lead to a series of issues, but there are fewer journalists that are actually there. So when you left, which is only, 3 days, 72 hours ago.
Yeah.
What was going on? What did you witness? What do you think is important for us to know?
So what I was seeing, I guess, on a multitude of levels, so over the course of that few months since the Talibans took over, you did see them go from trying to be this sort of very open and welcoming government to being extremely trying to control everything, extremely trying to censor, terrified to do interviews, terrified. So it went from very much open access to very difficult access. So I was seeing a big clampdown. Even I was getting harassed when I would go to a cafe and be in a family section, and
which is how you had to go as a woman.
Yeah, as a woman. And I remember, one particular occasion which concerned me. Jake's my photographer. Jake and I was sitting outside in the family section, which is women and whoever, and nobody's allowed to go there. The Talibans are not allowed to go into a private area. But these Talibans came up to us and started demanding to know who we were, our IDs. He was being way nicer to them than I ever would be. He's like, I'm a photographer, she's a writer. And he said, I don't think so. And as soon as he said that, I wasn't putting up with that. I was absolutely not. And when he was trying to get my ID, I said, I'm not showing you anything. You don't need to know anything. And so you're sort of seeing this clampdown that tends to happen in dictatorships, like in Syria and other places. That's the sort of thing that happens. And I filed a complaint with the Talibans. I went to the command. I said these two people approached me inappropriately in a family section, and they were court-martialed over it. And I thought, if I don't say something, it might seem something very small and insignificant, but they need to learn a lesson now, not in 6 months. You cannot do that. This is not how countries operate. So small things like that. So I was seeing a lot of change just in them trying to control the situation. And then on top of that, the humanitarian crisis, I mean, it's something unfathomable. When I went to Afghanistan originally, it was 70 cents to the dollar, 70,000 Afghanis to the dollar. And it's 100 now. That's how much the currency has fallen in this small period of time. And people can't afford the basics. I mean, it was a poor country anyway. And now people can't afford, there really is no middle class. It's all lower class. People are selling their belongings in the street. People can't even afford a piece of bread, which is equivalent of 10 cents to us, the big loaves. And the hospitals, the problem is nobody's been getting paid. So people haven't, even under the previous government, it's gone 3, 4, 5 months without getting any salary. So people are just sort of working on this idea of getting a salary. And the US froze $9.5 billion when the Talibans came in. And so they don't have money to run a country. There's no cash coming in. I even had a friend that sent me a Western Union, and I could just never get it because every time I went to Western Union, there was no cash. I couldn't go to an ATM. So you need cash. There's no hard cash in the country, and there's nothing coming in. So it's really running out very fast. The unemployment is huge. And I'm really terrified. And when you look at the medical sector, there's no medicine. It's run out.
Well, this is a conundrum for the United States because we have to decide if we allow aid to go back in to a government that we may not want to recognize to help the people that are the most innocent, or we don't. And it's not just the United States, it's many other countries as well, trying to make that calculation of what's actually best in the end, the outcome, to have our aid go in there to help the innocent, or let the Taliban try to run the country. Why don't you think the Taliban were more set up to prepared for this? If they've been fighting for this for 20 years and they do have the leadership in place, why do you think it's so bad?
I think the Taliban's probably never expected aid to be frozen in that way. Also, the Taliban's run on they make money through drug trafficking and other things, but they operate on very low overhead. Their fighters don't get paid. So you have these Talibans that are walking around hungry in the street because they fight for jihad. They fight for an ideology. They don't fight to get money. Then they're not operating on a high overhead to begin with, but obviously when you're running a country of 38 million people, you have very different needs and concerns. So I don't think that calculation, I think they just assumed that things were going to sort of continue as normal, and they obviously weren't. So they just don't have the funds. And they're not like a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda that generally will get, say, oil money or get money from the Arab countries or things like that. So they're very, basically what they have is what they give out. So I think they weren't prepared for that. And I think a lot of the countries probably do want to have some sort of diplomatic relations, but everybody is scared of America. Everybody's looking to what decision America is going to make. And I think it's an uncomfortable decision, and there is no, you sort of have to choose what the lesser of the evils is going to be, and the decision that America is going to have to make. Do we, give some sort of recognition to the Talibans, to give them the aid money so that the innocent Afghans who've been at war forever, who had no choice in any of this, can live some sort of life with dignity? Or do we say, oh no, because of the human rights violations, we're not going to recognize them, and sort of try to turn a blind eye? And it's an uncomfortable decision for diplomats to make. But I think, we are going to have to make that decision.
Well, there'll be plenty of policy debate on that. There's going to be enough people to have righteous debates about all sides of that. And it's surely going to be a story that we'll continue to watch. As a journalist and as a mother, I think about those children in Afghanistan that are facing hunger. And I think about my kids, and they're both going to be growing up in a world that they're going to have to figure out someday. And it really makes you wonder, that ultimate question, which is, we may be done with the war in Afghanistan. Is the war in Afghanistan done with us, whether it's in a traditional way or another way? And again, these are really big questions. How does it feel like just being back, Hollie? I mean, you haven't been in America for, almost half a year. And you've been somewhere that very few people have been, and you've been by yourself a lot of the time. I mean, how does it feel to be back here?
It was extremely difficult to leave. I think I always struggle when I leave a place, but I really struggle leaving Afghanistan. I probably would have stayed if it wasn't for coming to New York this week for some commitments, but it was a struggle to leave. It really was.
Why?
I think I felt very indebted to people that were there. I felt very just sort of worried, I think, about the story just disappearing, and people being left behind, and just every day, I get so many messages on LinkedIn, on my WhatsApp, from people who just say we're just desperate to leave, desperate for help, desperate for something, and I can't really offer much beyond telling their stories. And I just felt extreme guilt. I thought, my life isn't any more valuable than theirs. I just happened to be born in a different geographical coordinates that enabled me to get a different passport, that enabled me to live a much different life and to have that freedom to get on that plane and leave, whereas the people that are living there don't have that. And there's a lot of guilt, I think, that comes with that. And never being able to do enough.
Oh, well, that's certainly a feeling I think a lot of people relate to in different ways.
Yeah.
I could sense it, though, sitting here with you. We always like to ask the question, our final question, which is, if you could leave people with one thing so that they do feel smarter about Afghanistan, so they do feel more connected to this story, what is the one thing you'd like to share with our audience?
I think I'd like to say, so much we see on social media is the really sort of the doom and gloom and terrible side that we see of Afghanistan. But I also want to remind people that Afghanistan might be a very bleeding country, but it's a very beautiful place. And the people there are probably the most resilient people you could ever meet. They're people that will, go to whatever lengths that they can to feed their family, to survive, to rebuild whatever has been taken from them. And so I think that we shouldn't sort of look at Afghanistan as a lost cause. I think we should look at Afghanistan as obviously entering a daunting chapter, but still a chapter that we can play a positive role in. The Afghans themselves are willing to do whatever it takes to make their country a better place. And I think, it's also important not to lose hope. Yeah.
I'm glad to sit next to you.
Thank you.
It's so good
Thank
to see
you.
It's going to make me cry.
Yeah, I know.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, smarter news, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing Smarter.